All right, so this video is going to be the first in a new series, a new unit. I'm going to call this stuff, we'll call this responses, or maybe better, effects of the Renaissance and the Reformation. Now, these are two pretty disparate topics that we're going to cover in this unit. The first one of which is going to be these new monarchies, which are kind of like proto absolute monarchies. They're not quite absolute monarchies, but they're on the road to absolute monarchy. The other one of these, which we'll spend a little bit more time on, are the explorations. So, the age of exploration. So, two ideas that are not quite the same, but both of these are kind of connected to what's been going on with the Renaissance and the Reformation. So we'll start first with these new monarchies. This is a smaller topic, so I really think this might only be 2 videos long. So new monarchies. So I kind of see this going in 2 videos. We'll try to break this into 2. And after we finish with this, we'll start looking at the topic of European exploration. But first things first, let's talk about new monarchies. So let's kind of think about the medieval power structures. So let's take a step back and do a quick refresher of how things looked prior to the Renaissance. So here's our medieval power structure. Remember, we had the feudal system. I'm not going to draw the whole thing again, but land came down that way, and all sorts of services and money went up that way, with the king kind of being the beneficiary of all of these services and the one who doles out the money, or he doles out the land. Now, the king owned the land, the nobility worked the land, extracting wealth. So the king owned the land. No, that's not a word. The king owned the land, and his subjects extracted wealth for him from the land. So that was basically how feudalism worked. Okay. Now, everybody required each other's position. Everybody needed the king to give out land, and the king needed all these other people to extract the wealth for him. However, with the church losing power, both through the Renaissance and the Reformation, the glue that held the feudal system together started to come apart. Because behind this whole system was the idea that the church was there to make sure everybody was doing the right thing. The church was the one who made sure the king didn't abuse his power. The church was the one that made sure that all of these people didn't rebel. The church was kind of the glue that held the feudal system together. And as we've seen with the Renaissance and the Reformation, the church is starting to lose its cohesive power. And as a result, the kings began to kind of exert more power over their subjects, kind of filling in for the church. So as the church starts to kind of pull back or is forced back because of the Renaissance and the Reformation, the kings step into that and they begin to grow their power. They begin to expand their authority. At the same time, another group of people that really aren't a part of the feudal system begin to exert some influence too. So a new group, not really found in the feudal system, begins to exert influence. And these are what are called burghers. Burghers are city folk. Like the feudal system is very much about like rural agriculture. There's not really cities involved in how the feudal system works. So these burghers, living in a burg, burghers aren't really involved in the feudal system, but their power is starting to grow pretty quickly because these guys are your rich, often merchants or skilled workers or educated people. So very quickly, these are your money people, these guys start to exert a lot of influence. And what they start to do when they exert their influence, it kind of forces more cracks into a system that is already unstable. So there's no room for these guys in the feudal system, so they have to kind of force their way into the system. And that's going to upend the feudal system even more. So the church is losing power, and the kings are kind of breaking the system that way. These rich city folk are also forcing more cracks into the system. And so the feudal system is starting to break down, and these new monarchies are the things we see as a result of the feudal system still kind of existing, but also transitioning into something new, which will pretty much be absolute monarchy once the feudal system is more or less dismantled. So in the end, what we're talking about here is a debate. This is a debate about who can guarantee law and order. Who can guarantee property rights? these things matter to the money people. These things matter to the people with the money. So the money people, the burghers, they don't really care who does it. They just want someone who will guarantee stability and guarantee that their property is protected. In Western Europe, the rich people throw their support behind are kings. They think that the king is the one who can actually do this. In Eastern Europe, and we'll spend a little bit of time in Eastern Europe in our second video. In Eastern Europe, this is more or less the nobility. Nope, that's not how you spell that word. The nobility. So if we think about this a different way, kings are central rulers. The nobility are more regional. So we're going to see a difference here between having centralized rule in Western Europe versus kind of decentralized regional rule in Eastern Europe. Okay, so let's look at a couple of examples. Maybe the best example of this would be England. So let's take a quick look at England. Now, remember, we're talking about England, not Great Britain or the United Kingdom. These don't exist until 1707. So until then, we're really only talking about England, which is the southeastern part of the country, or of that island. So this part, that is England. Okay, so going back to England, the last time we talked about England, they had lost the 100 Years' War. They lost the 100 Years' War, and losing the 100 Years' War triggered a civil war in England. And this civil war was called the War of the Roses, because the two warring factions had different color roses as their symbol. One symbol was white, the other was red. Not really important for our purposes, but what this does indicate is that they were fighting for about 150 years. So they were fighting until 1485. So they were either fighting in the 100 Years' War or in the War of the Roses. They were fighting until 1485, which means that to fund these wars, they needed strong, centralized tax systems. And where we find these strong, centralized tax systems, that's where normally we're going to find these new monarchies. That's kind of it's not a necessary factor, but it's something that it's something that you're probably going to see when you see a new monarchy. You're going to see a strong, centralized tax system. And that's kind of the first step in creating a new monarchy and then an absolute monarchy, which we'll cover in time period 2. So the guy who kind of stands out at the end of this is Henry VII. So Henry VII, he is in charge. He reigns from 1485 to 1509. So he wins the War of the Roses. He actually killed his opponent on the battlefield, and that's how he became king. I think one of the last kings of England to actually do that. And it's so dramatic that Shakespeare writes about all this stuff. So I mean, this is a rich story in and of itself that we don't really have time to cover. Now, what Henry VII's most important contribution to this, besides killing his opponent on the battlefield, what he did for this process of new monarchies was that he created this thing called the Star Chamber. Now, the Star Chamber was a kinda, sorta Supreme Court. There really wasn't the idea of a Supreme Court in England at the time. What the Star Chamber was it was a court that kind of served as a supplemental court. So the Star Chamber acted as a court for special cases. It was for private property, which most people did not own. It was a case for the very wealthy that regular courts might not feel comfortable dealing with, or just cases that were too sensitive for regular court. Now, who is the one deciding these cases? Well, it was the king himself and his closest advisors. And so when we think about who is guaranteeing like our property rights and the cases that are too sensitive for regular people, like the really expensive stuff, there we go. These are the guys that are guaranteeing the property rights and the law and order for the rich people. And just in case you're curious, the Star Chamber is called the Star Chamber because it was a room with stars painted on the ceiling. Not really that special. It was just called the Star Chamber because it just described what the room was look like. It actually sounds more scary or serious than it actually was. It was just a room with stars painted on the ceiling. But the important thing to note here is that the Star Chamber acted as a way to guarantee law and order for the rich people. And in return, the rich people are going to supply the king with tax money. So these guys protect property rights, and in return, the rich people feel comfortable paying taxes. Now, eventually, and we'll worry about this when we get there, eventually the Star Chamber becomes later kings' personal court that he can punish rivals in. Like, you can haul your rivals into the Star Chamber and accuse them of crimes they may or may not have done, and then, execute them. So eventually it kind of becomes seen as a symbol of arbitrary power in the king. But when Henry VII starts it, it really is just a way to protect property rights. But eventually it's going to turn into something that causes the kings of England some trouble, because it's seen as an excess of arbitrary power. So that's kind of the important thing to note about England and their new monarchy. We're going to end quickly with just a little bit of stuff about France. Now, we're going to be talking a lot about France in this course. We're going to talk about France extensively when we talk about the wars of religion, not to mention absolute monarchy and the French Revolution. So we don't need to dwell on France too much right now, but there are a couple of points to make about France. France won the 100 Years' War. Which means that they had a head start on peaceful centralization, which is pretty much going to take the same form as what we see in England, which is going to be that centralized tax system, where everybody pays taxes into the center. The one kind of weird thing about France, though, is that France also centralized their church bureaucracy. So unlike other countries in Europe, the French kings got to appoint their own bishops. This was a right that was given to French kings centuries before this, and the Pope did not like this. Remember, the Pope did not like the lay people appointing bishops, but this was something that the French managed to extract from the Pope and hold on to it, even though the Pope hated it. The kings got to appoint their own bishops to the church, to the Catholic Church. So the French church actually gets a different name. It's still the Catholic Church, but because of this unique relationship between the church, between the king, the bishops, and the church, sometimes we refer to the French Catholic Church as the Galician Church. So you might see that somewhere. If you ever see this, just remember it refers to the Catholic Church in France. So the French church was always a little bit more independent than other Catholic churches. We'll see why that is important as we move through the first time period, because France is always going to be a little bit more politically minded when it comes to religion rather than just trying to make the Pope happy. And just to throw out this little bit of trivia, the king that managed to do this was Louis the Ninth. So the one that earned this right was Louis the Ninth, who later goes on to be named Saint Louis. He's the only French king to be beatified and made into a saint. So that's, a little bit of trivia, and that's where we get the American city of St. Louis was named after this French king. So I'm going to stop there. I've run out of paper, so I'm going to stop there. We'll pick this up in the next video by looking at a few other countries and how they relate to this concept of new monarchy. But the best example of a new monarchy, if you remember any of them, it is going to be England. And remember the concept of the Star Chamber. Okay, so I'm going to stop there. This is Mr. Nissen signing off.